Welcome back to another edition of Boilers Extra. I'm Nathan Baird from Indy Star.
Sam King from the Journal and Courier.
Purdue learned its NCAA tournament path tonight. It is the 4 seed in the Midwest Regional, though it will play in Providence, Rhode Island in the first and potentially second rounds. And their first opponent is the 13 seed High Point, which, if you've been following the bracketology, was a name that has been on that, like solidly on that 13 line, and was coming up in a lot of the permutations of potential possible opponents for Purdue. So first up, Sam, Purdue ends up number 14 on the seed line overall. That is a solid 4 seed. Like, they had some room, some wiggle room.
That's almost being a 3 seed.
It's not that far off. I mean, it's right in the middle, but it tells you both, like, I think, like, where this team could have been if it had won one more game. Like, if you beat Wisconsin at home, how much does that change things? Does it get you onto the 3 line? But I think it still reflected where this team – what this team has done, but what it hasn't done. I think it was a reflection both of the great resume it built up until mid-February, and then the fact that it plateaued there and just wasn't able to push it anywhere else. But I think they would, 4 is better than 5. I think 4s, if you look at like historically the upsets, 13s and 12s, it's fairly close. I would still rather be a 4. I think your chances of getting a really hot upstart team at a 12 is much higher.
Yeah, and this tells me that the conference tournament didn't mean a whole lot. And one of the things that was said as we were watching the selection show in the Mackey Arena media room was North Carolina got into the field based solely on basically its out-of-conference schedule and how challenging that was. And I wonder how much that played into Purdue's favor being, the 14 overall seed, because it played a really challenging non-conference schedule and won some of those games. North Carolina won one game out of its batch, and Purdue, beating Alabama, but also playing Marquette, playing Auburn. Some of those teams really probably helped bolster the net rating, which I'm not sure how much that means, but Purdue had a solid schedule outside of the conference, beat some very quality opponents. And then some of the games that were early in the Big Ten, beating Maryland, I think ended up being huge probably for this team, even though Maryland probably didn't get the favorable seed based on its resume. But yeah, I think Purdue should be pretty satisfied with where it's sitting as a 4 seed, playing a 13 seed that's never been in the NCAA tournament before. It's in one of those leagues, the Big South, where if you don't win your conference tournament, you don't make the NCAA tournament. So Purdue does have that working in its favor, where a lot of guys who have just been in the Final Four in a national championship game are now playing a team made up of guys who, at least at High Point, haven't done this before.
And experience is a good way to sort of start this conversation. We don't know a ton about High Point. We can tell you that, you look at their resume and they've scored some points. They're a veteran team, but they're not an NCAA tournament experienced team. I looked over their roster and I found 3 guys who had been on rosters at other places that were in the NCAA tournament, but only one of them, I can't remember his name now. It's I'm drawing a blank on it. Ricky Pearsall, maybe. Who played at Kansas in 2023 before he transferred to High Point. He did play in a couple games with Kansas that year, team that lost the second round, actually, to Arkansas, who they're about to play. And was that in Providence?
Wow, no, I'm saying Kansas is in Providence.
Arkansas Kansas is in Providence. Yes, they're doing a rematch of that game here 2 years later. But regardless of that, Purdue obviously is overflowing with NCAA tournament experience. I mean, obviously, Raleigh Burgess, C.J. Cox, and Jakari Harris are going to get their first taste of it. But this is another team that the rest of this roster is grizzled NCAA tournament veterans, really, at this point. Even guys who are only second-year players went through 6 games last year. They know about the atmosphere. I would think that whatever butterflies you get will be a little bit tampered down by the fact that this is a little bit more of a business-like approach that they can take to this year.
Yeah, and Matt Painter said it here at the podium earlier tonight. Caleb First has played in 10, I think he said, NCAA tournament games. The junior trio there with Trey Coffin-Wren and Fletcher Lawyer and Braden Smith, they've played in 7. Now 6 of those were last year, but still I think something's to be said about being in a 1 versus 16 game and losing. I think that sparked what happened last year, but it also tells these guys going into this tournament, you can't take any matchup for granted, even though you're a 4 and High Point's a 13. And if you're in this field, you're good enough to beat the team across the bench from you.
Something that kind of been on my mind. I wrote about it for IndyStar.com. I don't know if it'll be up before. If people see this on Sunday night, it'll certainly be up Monday morning. But this is the first team in 44 years from Purdue that gets to go into the NCAA tournament without that bugaboo of not being a Final Four team. Now, really, it's not 44 years, because after you go to a Final Four, it's kind of the point of what I was writing about. After you get that, it buys you some time, right? Like, nobody goes to the Final Four every year. Like, even Duke and Kansas and Tom Izzo don't go to the Final Four every year. So you buy yourself some time, and I feel like this team is in a great position of being a team that can accomplish a lot, but doesn't go in with this place would not so much just like in Purdue as we are in Purdue. When I say this place, I kind of mean the greater Purdue experience, the fan base, everything else. Like you would feel some of that tension when they would have a great team going into the tournament, high expectations, because there have just been so many letdowns over the years, so many like close calls or teams that didn't even make a close call because they lost early, or an injury that happens. And Fletcher Lawyer sounds like I don't know if fine is the right word, but he's going to play.
He will definitely play, is what Matt Painter said.
Yeah. So this team doesn't have any of that. I feel like this is a team that, in my opinion, should benefit from experience and just clarity. Like, they get to go in and just worry about winning the basketball game in front of them, not trying to win a few decades worth of games and a few decades worth of NCAA tournaments.
Yeah, that's actually a great point, because I felt like 2 years ago, there was such tremendous pressure on a team that collectively hadn't done anything yet except win a Big Ten regular season and tournament championship. As far as an NCAA tournament, you're starting 2 freshman guards that year who had never done it before. And lo and behold, other than Zach Edey, nobody really showed up that game. And now, I guess kind of the pressure is off to have to live up to these expectations of being, first of all, last year's team was a juggernaut and a 1 seed, the number 1 overall seed, I believe, in the tournament. So there was maybe added pressure there, but it almost seemed like that team was kind of waiting for that moment all season last year. Just get us to that NCAA tournament and let's write that 16/1 seed, send that off into the sunset. And Purdue's done that now. So now people's most recent memory of the postseason is playing in a national championship game against, that UConn team was probably one of the greatest teams in the last several decades. So no shame in losing that, but you got there now, and now you return several guys who played in that game, played in the Final Four, even because Purdue was able to kind of have its way with Grambling and Utah State last year and Gonzaga in the Sweet 16. A lot of those guys, the Kim Heides, the Miles Colvins, they got some run in the NCAA tournament, some, expanded minutes basically because of the outcomes of those games, and that benefits you going forward. And now I think that Purdue's really in a situation after the loss to Michigan in the Big Ten tournament, we're all waiting to talk to Miles Colvin, who was getting dressed. And when he sat down, one of the things he said, I don't remember exactly what the question was, but one of the things he said was, we still expect to go to the Final Four. That is still our goal. So like now that you've done that, I think that becomes kind of your expectation, and you can, with reason, kind of have that set as a goal and have it set as a goal without the pressures of feeling like you don't live up to it if you don't make it there.
So I think there is a different kind of pressure, though, and it stems to what we were talking about before, which was like on February 10th or whatever, going into that game February 11th at Michigan. This was a team that was in first place all alone in the Big Ten and was a likely 2 seed, which is what Michigan State ended up as, possibly pushing for, can you get into that conversation to be the 4th 1 seed, which seemed like it could be open at the time for somebody to step up and grab it. And to now be kind of limping in, they've lost 6 of their last 9. They're 1-6 against NCAA tournament teams in that span. And this is what you've done most recently. And I thought it was interesting that Matt Painter was talking about how that your last 10 games used to be part of the formula for deciding NCAA tournament teams. And he said, well, they got rid of that because what if your last 10 games just happen to be easy and you shouldn't get an advantage there? Well, their last 10 games were not easy. Their last 10 games were against a lot of NCAA tournament teams, and they didn't look very good at times, maybe through the majority of that stretch.
2 of those wins are against USC, by the way.
Yeah.
2 of the 3 wins.
Yeah. And right, exactly. And then 1 against Rutgers in that span. So 1 win, and just in the 6 of 9, they have 3 wins. It's UCLA at home.
Okay, you're right. Yeah,
Rutgers and USC, but 2 of those teams were not anywhere close to the NCAA tournament, and struggled to make the Big Ten tournament, frankly. So I do think this is a team that probably has a little bit of a chip on its shoulder about that. Caleb First was asked, I think the way it was worded was, do you have kind of an underdog mentality here? And he's like, well, like probably not an underdog necessarily. I mean, they're the defending national runner-up, and I think they're confident in how good they are, but I think they know that they have not played their best and have not necessarily looked like a team that has NCAA tournament staying power. I think they go into this weekend with something to prove that they can do at least some of what last year's team can do, and that they are not just this potential hanging off in the balance for what next year's team could be with even more experience. They need to and want to prove that they can accomplish what's in front of them.
Yeah, very much so. And as a 4 seed, you probably don't take an underdog mentality, because by seed line anyway, you would be, projected to go to the Sweet 16 and get out of this first weekend. That said, your potential second round opponents, Clemson, was a player or two away from going to the Final Four last year against Alabama. So it's not like Purdue got an easy draw. I think that, as a 4 seed, it probably is more favorable than maybe what some other 4 seeds got. But this is going to be a tough path, starting with High Point, which averages 82 points a game and ranks 18th nationally. But that first round matchup, I just think when you look at the defensive statistics, Purdue's got a lot of advantages there. When you look at the matchups, I like Purdue to get out of there, and then anything can kind of happen. I think the best case scenario for Purdue happen though, where if you win these first two rounds, you're going to Indianapolis, and that's really what matters.
You saw this kind of building over the last few weeks, which was once they had that losing streak and just kind of receded off of those higher and frankly, other Big Ten teams surpassed them, right? Like Michigan State was going to get Cleveland. Like they were going to have to put them there. So you got to, it just throws things off. They weren't going to get to go to Milwaukee because Wisconsin was probably going to have the advantage there. Like it would have taken some other machinations for them to end up there. They would have had to gotten, maybe if they fell all the way to a 6 and got matched with, but then you don't get matched with Wisconsin. Like it's a lot of nuances that go into it. So considering all that, I thought this was almost the very best case. I guess maybe a drive to Lexington and then ending up in Indianapolis would have been the most preferable route somehow if that had worked out. But other than that, everything else is a flight or a really long drive for most people. So the important thing is getting to come back to Indianapolis potentially for that next round. And listen, Purdue has not played anywhere near as well on the road as it has at home this year. I think we can say that. There have been 2 NCAA tournament teams that it has beaten away from home. One was it's escaping me now what the road win was. At Oregon, and
Ole Miss would be the other one, right?
And Ole Miss on a neutral court. I was there. It was a lot of Purdue fans. It was a heavy Purdue crowd. So like that isn't a lot on your resume of what you've done away from home. And we've seen some of the worst Purdue performances happen on the road. Now, I guess that should happen when you're playing really strong teams on the road, but that's what this time of the year is about. It's about overcoming that. So I think getting back to Indianapolis, I think you're right. I think when you look at this path, and other than as opposed to what it could have been, having to go to Seattle and maybe playing, now Clemson is a really tough 5 seed, but you could have gotten an easier 5 seed, but they have to go like all the way to Seattle and then go to San Francisco or something like that. I think getting to come all back to Indianapolis in the second weekend, we're getting way ahead of ourselves, but getting back to Indianapolis in the second weekend is a nice carrot out in front of this team as like the extra reward for winning if you can these first 2 games.
Yeah, very much so. And if Purdue gets there, I expect Purdue to have a pretty nice turnout, even in Providence. But if Purdue gets there,
they always,
last year, Purdue got to the Final Four, but it played 2 rounds in Indianapolis and 2 rounds in Detroit, and those were almost de facto home environments with the crowd. They were not neutral sites whatsoever when you factor in the crowd noise and which team they were backing. So that would then set you up in a favorable, maybe comfortable situation where Purdue has played in Indianapolis quite a bit over the years, including last week, including earlier this season, including last year in the NCAA tournaments.
And honestly, the fact that they get to funnel to Indianapolis, you're talking about home crowds, like maybe it even helps the crowd in Providence because people know they don't have to pay for like 2 trips, right? You got 1 trip this year. I mean, unless they go all the way to the Final Four, but like you've got 1 trip, you don't have to make
pay for it regardless.
Right. You probably figure that out, but you don't have to, Indianapolis will be a much cheaper thing for a lot of Purdue fans. So we're straying from the point here a little bit. We should talk more basketball, I suppose. High Point, they are a top 25 team, I believe, in adjusted offensive efficiency if you go by Ken Palm. Defensively, and that, some of that can be like opponent corrected and stuff. Defensively, though, 227. And they did not play a high major opponent all season. And this is where it feels to me like a strong start. I thought they were getting some good questions tonight about energy, because Matt Painter has talked in the past, over the past several weeks, about the energy kind of coming and going. And I think somehow this team has to find energy from the start of that game on Thursday, because if you let a team like this hang around, that's when you get in trouble. A team that can make shots, a team that has the confidence to go out and score against anybody. I think you need to go out and show them what a high major team looks like from the opening minutes of that game. You can't get what you had, kind of a sluggish start at the Big Ten tournament, some other sluggish starts, or some games where they let a team surge back in towards the end of the first half. Like, those have really been happening a lot in the last several weeks. They've got to come out and make a bit of a statement. They've got to thump this opponent, knock them back, and make them play on their terms.
Yeah, I talked to Fletcher Lawyer about this after the Big Ten tournament game against USC, because he had mentioned after the Illinois game, we can't just play with that effort on the boards because we're playing Illinois, who's the best rebounding team in the league. It has to be every night.
Yeah. And
then against USC, it was not there at times. And carrying over from that, I asked Jakari Harris, who played harder than anybody against Michigan by far, just from what I watched. I said, did this team play hard for 40 minutes tonight? And he was honest. He said, no, we didn't. There were lapses where we didn't play with the energy we have to play with to beat a team like Michigan. And it was obvious. And you can talk about the shots not going in or whatever, but energy shouldn't be affected by, giving up a play on the defensive end or missing shots. That should just be there all the time. And if Purdue plays with that, I think that, when those shots do eventually go in or whatever, you get a defensive stop, it carries over and can ride you to the finish line. Now, that's easier to do probably against a High Point than a Michigan, which is why, to your points, you can't let these teams hang around. 2 years ago, Purdue was just far superior to Fairleigh Dickinson and just kept letting that team linger and linger and linger and linger. And then finally, Fairleigh Dickinson gets a lead, and you're thinking like, oh man, this might happen here. And eventually it did. And there's a reason these upsets happen every year in the NCAA tournament. One, because teams are scheming for a specific opponent for like 4 straight days. But secondly, because all of these teams are good enough to win, which is how they got here in the first place.
I can't remember the exact quote that he used tonight, but in answer to a question that I had asked, Matt Painter said something about, as far as respect for our opponents, we're going to have plenty of it. Or so I can't remember what it said, but there's no team in this field that knows better how little these seeds matter to some extent. Like, the whole thing starts over. You're going to win a series of 1-game seasons, really, not to talk about coach speak, but it really is that. I mean, obviously their specific example, the 16 and the 1, but even last year, they finally get to a Final Four. Who's waiting on them? An 11 seed. Like, I was looking back, it's something like every year since 2013, there's been at least one team seeded 4 or lower that's made the Final Four. And it's like 17 of the 44 Final Four teams. So like 37% of the Final Four teams. So more than a quarter of them have been 4 seed or lower. Like, it's a couple of years ago, it was all of them. I think it was 4 teams seeded 4 or lower. So like, the path is here. Like, there's definitely, I don't mean to say this is a backhanded compliment. Like, worse teams than this Purdue team have made a Final Four. That's more about just how random this event can be, though, and about how what can you do on the one night when you have the opportunity right in front of you. And I think what is telling is that an opportunity was in front of Purdue over the past several weeks. There have been a series of opportunities, and in some cases, they really failed to seize the opportunity. The Indiana game is the one that really sticks out to me. The Ohio State game at home, sticks out to me. Though that was a little bit, coming back from the West Coast, the Wisconsin game at home, like that's where you were in control. You had it on your terms and you couldn't finish it off. The Illinois game, even though that got away, I mean, there was a lot of stakes there. If they'd won that game, they would have been a better seed for the Big Ten tournament. Like things like that. Like they've had games in front of them that they've needed to win that had real stakes and haven't been able to get it done against the best teams on their schedule for several weeks. So that's still something that this team has to answer to going into Thursday. It's like, what can you do between now and Thursday that gets your head back on correctly so that even if you lose, don't be because you kind of self-sabotaged.
Yeah, and one thing about this team, Caleb Furst is the only senior as of right now, is the only guy that we know that won't be back on this roster next year. Now that could always change, especially in this day of college basketball, but there has to be a sense of urgency for the guys who know they have more eligibility left. Last year, I felt like, with Zach Edey, with Mason Gillis, although he's now playing at Duke, with some of these guys, Lance Jones, who came to Purdue simply for a chance to go to a Final Four. They really wanted to win for the group, especially for the older guys, and especially probably for Zach Edey to kind of send him off to the NBA kind of on a high note. I think the sense of urgency has to be there, and I think it will be. There were some really frustrated guys after that Michigan loss versus a year ago when Purdue lost to Wisconsin in the Big Ten tournament. It was almost like, okay, well, we're going to go win the national championship, so we don't care about this tournament. It felt like that Michigan loss really hurt them, and just kind of after the fact, guys were like, man, this stings, but we have to brush it off and get ready for the next one. And now there is no next game. You can't say, well, we'll fix this and get it corrected for the next opponent. Now it's like, you don't correct it, your season is over.
Well, and they've taken that approach since I remember going back to the Marquette game. They could be talking to them after the Marquette game, talking to them after the Penn State game, games that they didn't compete well in the second half of those games. Like those games were in control by the opponent who was doing what they wanted to do for long stretches of those games. And talking to them after those games, especially the veteran guys, Braden Smith, Fletcher Lawyer, like basically saying like, hey, like, you lose games. Like that happens. We can't let that bother us, whatever. We can't let that drag us down. I think that's the right approach to take, but only if you then have the urgency now. Like it has to all be in the back of your mind that like there will be a point. The reason you don't let that become a distraction is to make yourself better for this time of year. And I'm sure there are fans who are concerned that that didn't happen because of the way these results have gone for the past several weeks. But I think there's also been some times where they've played well despite losing. The Illinois game would be one example of that. I don't know if I would count the Michigan game as an example of that, though. So, again, the most recent example, it's just a team that I think they've seen what it looks like when they beat the other best teams in the country. I think it's now a matter of almost individually having the mindset when that game comes to do the things you're supposed to do the things that has gotten away from them, which is just playing connected on defense. It's playing clean on offense. Can Traycoff and Wren avoid the offensive fouls that sometimes get him in foul trouble? Like those sorts of things are attainable for sure. You're not asking this team to be something it hasn't shown itself capable of being. Right. But now it's just a time where inconsistency will cost you in a way that it doesn't during the regular season.
And I'm real interested to see, and we didn't ask about this, and maybe this is something we talk to players about later this week, if there's maybe some different nuances of lineups and things like that we haven't seen yet, or, maybe throwing a curveball. And I don't know if you tinker with things after 33 games, you kind of become what you are at that point. But Kim Heide is a guy who's played very well here as of late. Jakari Harris is a guy who's played very well as of late, and they have probably earned the right to get more minutes. So do you let those guys have some more minutes? Do you possibly tinker with the starting lineup here going into the NCAA tournaments? I don't know, but I think that at this point, you have to go with whatever you think is going to give you the chance to win. And if that's, sitting somebody who's been playing a lot of minutes this year, that's just what you got to do. And Matt Painter knows that. He's done this long enough. This staff, and I think the players are mature enough to know that the people on the floor are giving us the best chance to win the game. So I'm definitely intrigued by how that goes and what kind of lineups and different matchups they can try to take advantage of, because we've seen some things lately, like Will Berg's been being inserted in the first half of games. That's, maybe something when you get into a mid-major team, they don't see a guy who's 7'2". Can you take advantage of that maybe in a short spurt and give Trey Coppin-Wren a rest, for example? Definitely intrigued by what kind of possibilities maybe are here when the season is on the line.
Yeah, what you bring up is intriguing because there are some different. I mean, we've all been thinking it like at times that, oh, maybe this would make more sense. Maybe this would make more sense. The thing is, that lineup, if it is the better one that night, does end up on the floor eventually. Like that's a second half, the back end of the second half lineup often has no bearing to the one at the beginning of the game. I thought an important step for Purdue in a way was the end of that USC game. They had to get stops on USC's last two possessions because it was still a tight game right there up until the last seconds. And they used two different lineups out there. One was like a big lineup and one was a small lineup, and both of them got the stops. And for a team that was like looking for any sort of defensive momentum, I thought that could be important. I was wrong. It didn't help at all against Michigan the next night. But maybe it's something that they can revisit this week. Like look for those sort of those moments where you, again, that your depth and your was a positive, that your depth was an asset, that you had multiple guys that you could count on. I think it's important that Fletcher Lawyer is healthy enough to play. I think if Matt Painter was talking about, boy, that really looked bad. Like he thought it was broken, the way that he was just sort of dangling arm when he walked off. I certainly had visions of Isaac Haas in Detroit in 2018 or whatever that was. And although it was kind of the opposite, because that one didn't look as bad as it was. We went and talked to him after the game. He's like, oh, yeah, it kind of hurts. And then we find out he's done for the year.
Kind of hurts they have to build a robot arm if I'm ever going to play basketball.
15 minutes later, we get an email. And then this one looked like horrific almost at first. And we're like, oh, that's the last we'll see of him. And then he's just checking back into the game. So probably something he'll have to play through, some kind of discomfort at the very least. But to have him, just from a veteran savvy standpoint, there's usually like one instance per game where he does something we're like, oh, that's just Fletcher Lawyer being smart. And then obviously the 3-point shooting, as long as this doesn't affect his shooting, that will be something that Purdue will need to beat any team in this tournament.
One thing I'd asked Braden Smith last week, and I'm not going to use it now because initially I was going to do something on Fletcher Lawyer and why he can help this team make a deep run in the tournament. Maybe I still use it. I don't know. But I asked Braden, do you think that Fletcher Lawyer is undervalued by everybody who's not on this roster? Meaning basically your opponents, teams that just look at your stats, whatever. And he said, yes, because he's the guy who gets us in all of our sets. He sees things on the floor as a coach and relays that to everybody out there, gets people in the right position. And he's kind of, I guess, the talker out there. And I said to Braden, I go, isn't that kind of your role? Do you guys butt heads at all when you do this? And he said, yeah, we do, but it's from a competitive nature and it's to make the team better. So they've played 107 straight starts together. They know what each other's thinking. They're in tune with each other. But I thought that was kind of telling, like, okay, even games where Fletcher Lawyer goes 0 for 6 against Michigan, he has value to this team because he's just a basketball savant that can make sure these guys are doing the right things. Now, it might not translate to success. It certainly didn't in the last game, but I think that he's a guy who can help you win in a lot of different ways, even when he's not scoring a ton of points.
We're going to be talking a lot more later this week. We'll be talking to you from.
We'll have a lot of downtime in Providence, Rhode Island.
Northeast, yeah. I've heard Providence is a fun town. I've never been there. I've never been to Rhode Island. Get across a state off of the list. We've already got a lot of coverage up at IndyStar.com, at JCOnline.com. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us wherever else you can follow us. And we'll be talking to you more through Boilers Extra later this week as well. I'm sure that probably even as early as Tuesday, once we're out there and settled up. We're traveling on Tuesday. Wednesday will be interviews, and that'll be earlier in the day. So we should be able to get a lot of stuff out to everybody in that afternoon. And then a 12:40 tip-off on Thursday. So kind of, starting the tournament almost is the defending national runner-up and trying to kind of make it stand and make another run.
Yeah, it's a drastic difference from recent years where Purdue's been playing in those 9 o'clock games, and Purdue's earned this. They played a lot of 8 and 9 o'clock games this season. So I'm definitely excited to get the tournament started off on that Thursday with Purdue tipping off.
Definitely love the early tips. So, and I know fans only care that it turns into a win. So we will let you know how that goes. Follow us at jconline.com, indystar.com. I'm Nathan Baird. He's Sam King. We'll talk to you again from Rhode Island.